Hello everyone, today we're going to be looking at Death of a Naturalist. This is the poetry anthology for GCSE English Literature, and this is a poem by Seamus Heaney. We're going to be looking at a first reading. We're going to look at specifically form, structure and language with a bit of context, just a bit of introductory stuff around this poem that could be useful for your English literature exam, the single poem or the comparison. Let's give it a first reading. This is Death of a Naturalist by Seamus Heaney. All year, the flax dam festered in the heart of the townland, green and heavy-headed. Flax had rotted there, weighted down by huge sods. Daily, it sweltered in the punishing sun. Bubbles gargled delicately. Blue bottles wove as strong gauze of sound around the smell. There were dragonflies, spotted butterflies, but best of all was the warm, thick slobber of frog spawn that grew like clotted water in the shade of the banks. Here, every spring, I would fill jam potfuls of jellied specks to range on the windowsills at home, on shelves at school, and wait and watch until the fastening dots burst into nimble, swimming tadpoles. Miss Walls would tell us how the daddy frog was called a bullfrog, and how he croaked, and how the mammy frog laid hundreds of little eggs, and this was frog spawn. You could tell the weather by frogs too, for they were yellow in the sun and brown in the rain. Then, one hot day, when fields were rank with cow dung in the grass, the angry frogs invaded the flax dam. I ducked through hedges to a coarse croaking that I had not heard before. The air was thick with a bass chorus. Right down the dam grass, bellied frogs were cocked on sods. Their loose necks pulsed like sails. Some hopped. The slap and plop were obscene threats. Some set poised like mud grenades, their blunt heads farting. I sickened, turned and ran. The great slime kings were gathered there for vengeance, and I knew that if I dipped my hand in the spawn would clutch it. Okay, that's our first reading out the way. So just a few things that you want to know about poetry. The things you want to look for is form. So the first thing you want to notice here is this form of this poetic form in this case is what's called free verse. Okay, so that is the form of this poem. Now, it's no good just mentioning that it's free verse. We need to talk about how it's relevant to that. And you can link it in with your context. So remember, Death of a Naturalist, this poem is about the speaker of the poem's death of the love of nature. Okay, so the speaker of this poem, the tone is childlike. We can tell that when we hear things like Mammy Frog and Daddy Frog, and Miss Walls would tell us how. So this is obviously like a childlike tone, and things like jam potfuls, for example, and admiration for nature, dragonflies and butterflies. Here the speaker is really intrigued by nature. So this is a nature poem, but it's also about childhood. So Seamus Heaney, he talks about his fascination of being a naturalist, somebody who's interested in nature, but it dies. Okay, so he no longer is interested in nature. Now, the free verse, you might talk about how actually the death of a naturalist is significant because it mirrors the speaker's natural and unfiltered thoughts. So natural and unfiltered thoughts, okay? So the way they think about nature, it feels more like a personal recollection of a stream of consciousness, maybe capturing the speaker's childhood excitement and unstructured thoughts. So remember, when we talk about context, you might think about the fact that actually Seamus Heaney grew up on a farm, and many of his poems reflect his childhood up on a farm. So we know that could have inspired this work. So maybe it's a reflection in many ways, the free verse. So it mimics natural speech. And the poem's free-flowing lines and enjambment create this conversational tone, making the memories and emotions feel authentic, rather than forced into like a rigid poetic form, like a sonnet, for example. So it's a metaphorical death of nature, not loving nature anymore. This fascination with dragonflies, butterflies, jam pools of jellied specks that's left on the windowsill. And the fact that he spends a lot of his time just simply watching the frog spawn transform. Even words like slobber, for example, they might be interesting. These are the bubbles, frog spawn. These are the things that children might be really fascinated by, okay? So that's one thing. Form, that's the free verse form. It reflects his childhood thoughts freely on the page. When we talk about structure, that's how it looks on the page. How many stanzas we got here? Well, it's very easy. We've got 2 stanzas. It's 2 stanzas. And remember, it's not enough just to say, oh, this is written in 2 stanzas. You need to talk about the significance of those 2 stanzas. So what's really interesting about those 2 stanzas? Well, you might turn around and say, it's interesting that the beginning of the poem, Heaney is fascinated by nature, but actually near the end of the poem, that love for nature dies, and actually Heaney's speaker goes on to run away and fear nature. So we have this shift, then one hot day when the fields were rank, we see that there. We have language which is quite military, invaded, for example. That adjective, angry for the frogs, that's really interesting for how the frogs are presented. They seem really angry at Heaney for, putting them in these jam pots, for example. And it's almost like a rebellion against, humanity in some ways. The way that these frogs are behaving, they've got this coarse croaking, and they're cocked like a gun, okay, like a weapon. And there's an obscene threat here, and they're poised like mud grenades. So you've got this simile here, a simile, to talk about how they are threatening to the speaker of this poem. And the fact that they're farting is quite repulsive. You could say that this is quite a repulsive thing for the speaker to experience. And then, of course, this is very interesting. The fact that Heaney, speaker, I sickened, turned and ran. This is a direct contrast to his enthusiasm and passion in the beginning. So metaphorically speaking, he has now lost his innocence and can see the dangers of the world, okay? So the loss of innocence, acknowledging the danger in the world, okay? And they're also labeled as the Great Slime Kings. That noun, king, that's a really interesting way to describe these frogs. It implies that the frogs now rule over the flax dam and that he is not wanted there. The adjective great, that's really interesting as well, suggests that they hold all the power. So Heaney's speaker is feeling a bit terrified. And whenever you're looking at poetry, it's always important to look at the beginning, the middle, and the end. And in this case, the end of this poem is the fear that if I dipped my hand, the spawn would clutch it. We can see here the verb, clutch, suggests that he is now afraid and scared of the frogs. He believes he will not be able to escape from this knowledge of how he views these angry frogs. And again, this is a metaphor for his loss of loving nature. It's the death of a naturalist, okay? So you've got structure, 2 stanzas. You've got the beginning, this fascination with nature. You've got, this really interesting language, sensory language, things like sounds and smells, slobber and bubbles and frog spawn and dragonflies. He's really interested in nature. And the middle, you can see how he's fascinated with how these frog spawns transform into actual frogs. And you can even, this reflective tone here, you could tell when the frogs were feeling. So this is quite a reflective, childlike tone in the middle. And the end is when Heaney's speaker quite literally sickens, turns and runs away from these angry frogs who are, a threat to the speaker here. So nature rebels against the speaker of the poem. So that's your beginning, middle, and end of Death of a Naturalist, and how nature is presented as threatening. So you've got two stanzas, beginning, middle, and end. You can look at the structure there. The form is free verse. You can see the link to Seamus Heaney. You've got to remember that Seamus Heaney was 4 years old when his brother died in a car accident. So Heaney was only a young boy. And that death kind of could have affected him badly in many of his poems. And we can see that loss of innocence here, that loss of loving nature here can be seen here. And he obviously grew up on a farm, like I mentioned. So these are all things you might want to mention in a single poem analysis. I hope that's helped. That's Death of a Naturalist. Please do comment, rate, subscribe. This is not everything. Remember, with poetry, anthology, for single poem and comparison, you only need to remember a few quotes. So you might remember, for example, Mammy Frog and Daddy Frog. That could be a tone. You might remember, for example, the sensory language of sound and smell. And that could talk about, you know, the context of him growing up. And you might then talk about the transition into the shift where you see, you know, Heaney is beginning to be terrified of the frogs. And that he feels repulsed and runs away. So that idea that then the poem changes his views in the second stanza. You could talk about that structurally and how the poem ends, his acknowledgement of how nature can be quite dangerous and he fears nature. Please do comment, like, subscribe, and stay tuned for the next video. Mrs. Singh will be looking at To Autumn. Thanks, guys. Take care. Bye-bye.